All right, I think we're ready to get started. So hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Allison, and I'm part of the education department at the Timken. And again, I just want to welcome you. Since we can't meet in person right now, we're really excited to be able to bring you a virtual tour of our collection. A couple of guidelines before we begin, specifically for those who are in our Zoom room. If you're watching from Zoom, we just ask that you keep yourself muted for the duration of the tour, just so there's no interrupting and everyone can hear our docent. If you have any questions or comments during the tour, we ask that you put them in the chat. So there's the bottom of your screen, there's a chat bubble, and it says chat underneath, and you can type all your questions and comments there. And then at the end, we'll do a little Q&A, a little conversation, and address those questions. If you're joining us from Facebook, welcome to you as well. And the same goes for you. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them in the comments section underneath the Facebook video. And we'll be monitoring that so you can join the conversation at the end as well. So with that, I want to introduce our topic and our docent. So today we will be hearing from Karen Helmerson, who has a master's in art history and a teaching background. And she will be presenting Faces from History, Portraits at the Timken and Beyond. So take it away, Karen.
Thank you, Allison. I just want to put a little plug in for Allison. Allison Grenda has been working with our education department. She's amazing. She is going to be embarking on a PhD program. We are so blessed to have her. She's integral to our education program. So thank you, Allison.
Oh, thank you.
I wanted to begin to talk a little bit about portraiture in general. And so we're going to look at the first painting by Jan van Eyck, the Arnolfini marriage portrait. Let's talk a little bit about the history of portraiture in art. It isn't in the Renaissance that portraiture begins. It actually begins in antiquity. And if you look at Rome, which was controlling Egypt more than about 2,000 years ago or a little bit more, they were creating what are called faium portraits, and they were pretty ubiquitous in Egypt. And faium portraits were very flat, very Byzantine in nature, and they were used as funerary portraits. So there's a very important history of these types of portraits. Also, the Romans loved to do busts or sculptural portraits of important government officials, etc. So this is not new to the Renaissance. However, in painting, the Renaissance really sees a surge in portrait painting. Why? Well, if you recall, the Renaissance is the rebirth of classical ideals, whether it's in mathematics and art and culture and literature, but it harkens back to antiquity as well, the Greco-Roman era, Greek mythology. And so this quest for a more humanistic view of the world, this is prior to the Enlightenment, but it's a more humanistic view of the world, and they wanted to portray more naturalistic topics and also people. And so it isn't so much the church controlling painting as it did in the medieval times. It is now people commissioning portraiture for various reasons. Now, this exquisite Netherlandish portrait by one of my all-time favorite artists, Jan van Eyck, was a marriage portrait. Just one more point I wanted to make is, why were portraits important? Well, it showed the prosperity of a person, an individual. It also preserved their life for posterity. So their place in the world was captured for eternity, really. And so it showed their soul, their inner belief system, their prosperity, and many things. And it would also symbolize a major event in their life. Now, Jan van Eyck was probably the greatest Netherlandish painter, with people like Robert Campen, Roger van der Weyden, Paetus Christus. We happen to have a major Paetus Christus who was a disciple of Jan van Eyck. Jan van Eyck is often sort of incorrectly attributed to oil painting, attributed to Jan van Eyck. He didn't really create oil painting, but he did really help develop it. And he really wanted to show the natural world, and he used these natural pigments. And so we have this magnificent, exquisite portrait. This is on panel. And if you know anything about the Ghent altarpiece, the most important Netherlandish altarpiece by Jan van Eyck, which is in the city of Ghent, which is not too far from the city of Bruges. Bruges, a magnificent city, was the major trading center in the early part of the Northern Renaissance. and later it became Antwerp and then eventually went into Amsterdam. But at this time, Bruges was a very significant trading center. And Arnolfini was actually Italian, and he was a high-born Italian who came to Bruges to do some trading and business. So he didn't live in Bruges permanently, he lived part-time there. This painting was a means of recording his uh, wedding to his bride. But there's a lot of historical discrepancies. Some people think that they weren't actually officially married till about 13 years later. For the sake of discussing this painting, we will talk about this as the betrothal of these two people. So let's talk a little bit about this exquisite chamber. These two are getting married in their bedroom chamber. And you can see an elegant bed in the background. You can see a carved chair, an elegant mirror, a beautiful candelabra, some stained glass on the left, some oranges on the left, in the foreground, a little dog, and some wooden clocks. Now, look at the rich, deep color of this oil painting. That is what Jan van Eyck is known for, the rich reds and the deep blues and greens. These two people hold hands. Now, you might say, where is a religious figure who would marry them? At this time in Bruges, in the 15th century, it was not required to have a clergy present. You could simply declare your decision to marry. However, if you look at this exquisite mirror in the background, you can see a very small depiction of another couple, and they were the witnesses to this betrothal. Also, you have a chandelier with one candle, and it represents the fact that Jesus is ubiquitous and witnessing this scene. And this is actually a very religious painting, even though it's not meant to be specifically religious. There's a lot of religious elements. As I said, Jesus overlooking the scene. If you look at the chair, in the middle ground, there's a little carving of Saint Margaret, who was actually the patron saint of childbirth and fertility. And so that there's a religious reference there. Also, the wooden clogs, which were used to go outside and inside, they represent the sanctity of this union. And then you have the little lap dog, which of course, you think of the word fido, fidelity. And so this enhances the representation of fidelity. Now, if you look at, so he holds the left hand, which means that she is of a little bit of lower status and that he takes over all rights of property. Pretty unfortunate at that time. So even though she does not come from a poor family, his status was much greater, so he gets to kind of control the situation. Now, are these aristocrats? No. Are they upper class, upper bourgeois? Yes, they are. How do we know that? The bedchamber is small. However, they have some elegant objects like oranges represent a delicacy. Her dress is exquisite, but she does not wear elaborate jewelry. His costume is very beautiful too, fine, rich fabric and ermine trim. But because of the smallness of scale and the fact that they don't have a lot of jewelry means that they're not the aristocratic members of society. Some people had thought that she might be pregnant in this painting. However, she is not. She is just holding the folds of her dress because at that time there was multi-dimensions to the clothing. So look at this perspective. He really creates a sort of three-dimensional presence, deep, rich oil painting, and a perfect capturing of life in the early part of the 15th century by the great Jan van Eyck. We're going to move on. And we have our very own Betrothal, portrait of a youth holding an arrow. It was done in 1500 to 1510. If you recall, that is the date of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Well, why am I bringing up Leonardo da Vinci? Because Betrothal, an Italian of an upper class family, was studying with Leonardo da Vinci in the studio of Leonardo. And it actually, this painting was once attributed to Leonardo da Vinci. It was later in the hands of Lord Elgin of England. And if you recall, Lord Elgin was the English aristocrat who took the Elgin marbles off the Parthenon and actually brought them to England. A lot of controversy still about that because the Greeks want to bring back their antiquities. That's still being bantered back and forth. So let's go back to this painting. This was, as I said, originally attributed to Leonardo da Vinci, and we found out it was school of, and Botrofio was the artist. It's a beautiful rendition of a young man named Cassio. And Cassio was also an aristocrat, knew Botrofio, wanted his likeness painted because, of course, if you were important, how better to save yourself for posterity than to have your portrait done. So Cassio was a poet in real life. And so as he has his portrait done, he wears a fillet of laurel leaves and he holds an arrow. What that represents is his connection to Apollo, or the interest of Apollo, who was a patron god of creativity, music, art, poetry. So Botrofio captures Cassio as he would be linked with Apollo. He looks very androgynous. So there's this kind of male-female quality to him. He wears exquisite clothing, which is an indication of his high status. Not only are his clothing, but the jewelry, the pearls at his collar. And if you've heard some of my other talks, and maybe from other docents or curators as well, pearls were the bling of that time period. So very rare to have pearls. So that also indicates his highborn status. Now, he confronts us. He looks at us. He's quietly contemplative, which is very interesting. I always bring in this little nugget of information that you don't see in these portraits, any of them smiling. And that was because of a couple things. Some people said, well, it's because they're sitting a very long time. Perhaps, but probably more indicative of the situation is that dental care was very bad at this time. So you would see more people mouth closed. So there was a lot of overpainting on this particular image because we did have, the age and some of the wear and tear, but it has been restored quite beautifully. Now, one of my favorite paintings is by Leonardo da Vinci and is Lady with an Ermine. And it was done about 10 years before the Mona Lisa. There are 3 portraits, non-religious portraits by Leonardo da Vinci that are extant today. One is in the National Gallery. One is here in Krakow, in a castle in Krakow, this Leonardo. And then there's, of course, the Mona Lisa. Now, who is this young woman? Her name was Cecilia Galeriani. And Galeriani is a little bit of a play on the word Gallier, and that is weasel. So when Leonardo paints this, the beautiful woman who was the mistress of the Duke of Milan, he paints her with sort of this little subtle connection to the word of her name and ermine. So an ermine is like a weasel, and it's white, which reflects her purity, although eventually she does have a child by the Duke. And she was painted here at the age of 16. She's a beautiful woman. Now, what do we know about her? Cecilia was a brilliant young woman. She was a poet, a philosopher, a thinker. So she wasn't just a beautiful face as a girlfriend of the Duke. She was known for her own intellectual capabilities. She was not an aristocrat by birth, more common, not common in a pejorative sense, but less of an aristocrat. But because of her skills as an intellectual, she was very captivating to the Duke. She, as I say, she's a very young woman, and her clothing reveals that she was, although important and well dressed, she wasn't of the highest class. You can also tell that in her modest jewelry. She wears just some decorative beads, and she has a beautiful dress, but it isn't the very detailed clothing and jewelry you'll see in the next portraits. So portraiture, there's almost movement in this portrait. The way she kind of turns and looks at us, kind of a 3/4 turn, you almost have to expect her to turn another way. The other thing that's remarkable about this painting is the way that Leonardo creates it. It almost is like a cutout, this very stark background. She kind of seems to project out from the dark background. Look at the exquisite nature of her skin tones, the realism of her beautiful hands, the turning of the ermine. So you capture momentum, you capture her beauty for posterity, and it is a window to the history of Italian Renaissance. One of my favorite paintings of all times. Now, let's compare to a painting done, let me just go back for just a second, and we'll look at just the type of clothing just for a second. Okay, so about 40 years later, and of course, this is one of your portraits in the tin. Let's talk a little about her costume. She was a lady waiting for Isabel Justice, you know, member of the court. So she was probably a lady in waiting. We don't know 100% about her. We just know she was an aristocrat and part of the court, Italian court. And how do we know that? Well, first of all, look at the monumental dress. I mean, this dress is magnificent, of the highest social caliber. We have these detachable sleeves with silk coming through, this brocade dress, this embroidered top of the dress. We have like a cummerbund, and then we have this exquisite set of lapis beads. There are pearls embedded in her headdress. She wears almost like a wig concoction, and we have this exquisite red velvet background, and this very, very pale white skin. Now there's a lot of controversy about this painting in the sense that we don't know 100% for sure everything about it, but we think that she might have died was completed. This is the last signed work by Veneto. So it was one of his later paintings. And there's a little card that hangs from the painting, and that actually is his signature. She is wearing thick gloves, and what these gloves might represent are falconeering gloves. Falconeering being a really important sport for the aristocracy. And however, some people say because the hands are switched, it might just be that she has these thick gloves. But I have a tendency to think that it might be falconeering gloves because of just the real thickness of it. Now she has that very pale skin, and she looks at us with a little bit of almost like a quizzical nature. Again, that mouth is tightly closed. She doesn't look particularly happy, but she's confident. So again, that pale skin might actually indicate that she was unhealthy, but we don't know for sure. So this is one of our magnificent Italian Renaissance portraits. We're going to move on to another Renaissance portrait done around the same time, and that is by Francois Clouet. And Clouet, excuse me, I just want to go back for 1 second. Look how elaborate this dress is, and very shortly thereafter, we have a much more simple style. Well, let's talk a little bit about that. Well, first of all, Francois Clouet was the painter to the French kings, and he paints Guy Comte de Laval, Guy the 17th Comte de Laval. He was a count, Comte's count, and his family was one of the most illustrious in all of France. His father had 5 sons. He was the only one who survived. His father died when he was 9. The count's father died when he was 9. And even though the Laval family, de indicating aristocracy, was one of the most famous in all of France, his father was a very prodigious gambler. And by the time this painting was done, when Guy Comte de Laval was 18, his father had nearly bankrupted the family. Now, he was married at 13, the count, to a very rich widow. And for a time, things went pretty well. But at 25, without fathering a child, he died. And it was not ever completely ascertained whether he died of smallpox or he was stabbed. So we're not quite sure about that. Now, let's look at the painting itself. So he's betrothed at 13. This portrait was done when he was 18, and he dies at 25, leaving a widow. She was so kind of destitute that she had to sell all the family jewels in order to continue with her life. Now, we know that he is an aristocrat because look at this exquisite, finely embroidered set of clothing. The rich velvet, the gold, the beautiful linear gold stripes, that exquisite collar made of fine linen. You probably can't see it, but at the very top, there's a little ostrich feather. And and this great hat with embellishments. So we know that he was an aristocrat, but he is painted in more somber tones. In fact, it's a very somber painting. He looks with consternation. He doesn't look happy, the subject of the painting, and perhaps it is because of the trials and tribulations of his family. What you also notice, he has a little scrim of a mustache, and that indicates his youth. As I said, he was only 18. The ears are so finely crafted. The face with that aquiline nose kind of tilts to the left. And you do not really even see any of his neck. So the collar, high rising collar, kind of covers that. This is also a very tiny portrait. It's very beautiful, it's very detailed, but it's very tiny. Um, so here we have another Renaissance portrait, and this happens to be French. And we're going to move on, however, to a little later period, and we're going to go into the Baroque. Now, this is Flemish Baroque, what would be today Belgium. And if you recall, before about 1609, Holland and Belgium were one territory, the Netherlandish region. And because of the Protestant Reformation, we have an interest in the Protestant sects, Calvinism, Lutheranism, and the Dutch in their inimitable way do not, in the north, they do not want to remain under the Habsburgs Catholics. And so there's a series of conflicts and treaties. And by about 1609, Holland and Belgium are separated. Peter Paul Rubens represents the Habsburg Belgians who are Catholic, and Rembrandt, who you're going to see momentarily, represents the Protestant Dutch, more middle class. So let's talk a little bit about Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens came from a more middle class family, but he was under the mentorship of a woman in Brussels, Belgium. And this woman was a countess, and she saw his brilliance, and she cultivated young Peter Paul and showed him manners and increased his knowledge of court and upper class activities. She saw that he was a very gifted linguist. He was studying Italian and French, and he was a traveler. When he was younger, he went into Italy. He loved the Italian Renaissance. He studied Venetian Renaissance painters like Titian. He went to Spain, did a lot of traveling. Some people think because of his gift of languages, his connection to the Italian court, he painted for the Medicis, for example, that he might have been spying. Could be. He also had a magnificent studio in Antwerp, where he eventually settled. A huge studio with many assistants. And today, I've been very blessed. A few years ago, I was able to, 2.5 years ago, I was able to visit his home in Antwerp. It's beautiful. Rubens' home in Antwerp is magnificent. Many of his paintings are there, his exquisite, wealthy home. He was a magnificent painter in the sense stylistically. He painted history paintings, he did portraiture, mythology. Many of his religious paintings are in churches all through Antwerp in particular. And so we're going to talk specifically about this painting. This painting is of a young man in armor. And we don't know specifically who he was because even though he might have existed, this is what's called the Trony portrait, Tronie. Trony portraits are popular in the Baroque. This is the 17th century. And the Baroque was known for not only its Counter-Reformation religious paintings, but it also shows a lot of exotic things. And in this particular case, we have this beautiful suit of armor, this really gesturally, painterly image, and we see this red crimson, like a scarf or whatever, across his shoulder. And you can see he looks at us with a really interesting side glance, the tousled curls of the very painterly background. Now, if you compare it from 100 years before, excuse me, we see that this is the Renaissance, a much tighter brushstroke. You don't necessarily the gestural hands of the painter, but in the Baroque, you do see that more gestural quality, more dramatic, more theatrical. And so this is kind of an indication of a switch in painterly styles. Now, around the same time, we have a painting by Anthony van Dyck. Anthony van Dyck was Flemish. He actually did study with Rubens. Rubens was his master painter. And we have Mary Villiers, a Lady Herbert of Sherland. Lady Villiers was part of the English court because Anthony van Dyck was such an important portrait painter at this time that the court of Charles I was very interested in having him come and paint. And what she did, he actually painted for some other British aristocrats. So he left uh, what would be today Belgium and did go into, he studied in Antwerp. And then he went into England for a time to paint for the court of Charles I. Now, Mary Villiers' father was part of the court of Charles I. So she was a very highborn young woman. An interesting thing about her is Van Dyck was also part of this upper class social circle, and so he knew her very well. He captures her in a beautiful, intimate portrait because he knows her sensibilities. Now, as you can imagine, I keep talking about upper class and aristocrats. Why is that? Well, it isn't until we really focus on Dutch portraits that we mostly see the aristocratic or highborn people getting painted because they had the means and the connections to do so. They wanted, as I mentioned earlier, their likeness for posterity. They wanted to be a view of the world from the past. So let's specifically talk about this painting. As you can see, Mary Villiers is in an exquisite gown, satin gown, and she holds a rose and she has these black ribbons. Well, she was married at a very young age. I believe she was 14. And very shortly after, she lost her husband, probably to smallpox. And so she was married a very brief time and died in her, he died in their teenage years, and she was left a widow at about 14 or 15. So she wears these black ribbons to commemorate the death of her husband and to signify that. But however, she's not in all black. Why? Because she's too young. And because she's such a highborn woman, it is important for her to remarry eventually. Now, what lets us know that she's a youth? Well, look at the yellow, that exquisite yellow. That's kind of a youthful color. She holds a flower, which represents metaphorically youth and life and death. So the Dutch and Flemish painters were very known, and particularly their still lifes, to incorporate memento mori, mementos of life and death. Well, what does a flower represent? Well, it represents beauty and youth, but also represents the ephemeral nature of life. A flower is picked, it's a bud, it begins to open in middle age, and then eventually it wilts. So it's a reference to youth, beauty, and also death. She wears these exquisite pearls, and as I mentioned a little bit earlier, pearls were the bling of the this time period. So if you had all these pearls, and look in her hair, her earrings, her necklace, and it shows her very highborn stature. Also, again, I've mentioned in the past that hands really indicate a highborn, an artist's ability to capture realism and nature. And so these hands are quite exquisite. Again, she looks at a contemplative at us, introspective. She sort of three-quarter turn. It's not a full-length portrait because in the very beginning of portrait painting, often they did a much shorter torso. In other words, they would probably stop at where her hands are. But as the Renaissance and Baroque progressed, we start to see more full-length portraits. So this is Mary Villiers. Father was a part of court of Charles I, painted by probably one of the greatest portrait painters of the Baroque era, especially of the Flemish Baroque. I wanted to show another painting that is not in our museum. It's a self-portrait by Anthony van Dyck. I just want to show you his skill. And this one is almost contemporary in the sense of its sensibility. Now, in art history, we know that portraiture is done because, of course, capturing the artists themselves, self-portraiture, but a lot of it Rembrandt, for example, loved to paint his own portrait because he wanted to sort of see his aging process, but also to help develop their skill sets. So if you maybe didn't have a sitter or you wanted to develop your skill sets as an artist, you often did your self-portrait. Now, as I said, Van Dyck was very important to the court of Charles I. He worked in England. And the reason why I point this out is he's holding a gold chain. And the gold chain was given to him by Charles I to indicate his importance to the court and his skill as an artist. You don't really see it, but his hand, which is holding the gold chain, actually has a medallion with a figure of Charles I. Now, Van Dyck points to a sunflower, a big, beautiful sunflower. And sunflowers have a lot of meaning in art. Some of it represents longevity. Now, which is a kind of a sad commentary because even though it indicates longevity and beauty and nature, unfortunately, Van Dyck died at about 41. So he did not live a very long time. And so it's ironic that this sunflower, which often indicates longevity in art, really sadly does not express that. Now, if you look at the source of light in this painting, it's really interesting. It comes at the bottom of the painting, and less light falls on his face. It's more on the shoulder and back region, which is kind of interesting. The other thing is you see this voluminous amount of clouds. Clouds were often presented in the Renaissance in portraiture because they wanted to indicate their interest in the natural world. And that's particularly true in the Baroque because particularly in Holland and Belgium too, we have this knowledge growth. We have a very important scientific growth in this time. So you were beginning to see more of a focus on nature and natural studies. So the last thing I want to mention about Van Dyck is this interesting beard and mustache. And his style of mustache and beard became so popular, they called it, to this day, the Van Dyck. Now I see that I always tend to go a little bit over, so I want to continue with the next painting. And this is Nicholas Moss, who actually studied with Rembrandt. And the portrait of a lady. This is a little bit unique. It's a small portrait in our Timken, and it's unique because you actually see a very high-born Dutch woman. And why I say that is because the Dutch at the time were a more middle-class society, and so they concentrated on the sort of Protestant ethos, which is a modesty, kind of restraint, moving away from the Habsburg monarchy and going more into the everyday people. But she was an important person, and Mary was actually married to William, who was Dutch. He was William of Orange. She was British, and this woman Mary, and they became William and Mary, who ruled in England. So this is a portrait before her royal, let's say, commission. And what's so unique about this is these exquisite colors. Rembrandt, who was his teacher, often used a lot of monochromatic colors, and that's quite different here. We have rich, lush, like a velvety cloth. Her dress is satin or silk. She has pearls embedded in the sleeve. She looks at us with confidence and beauty, the huge drop Baroque pearls and the necklace. She has her little lapdog. And if you recall, and I mentioned in the Arnolfini portrait, lapdogs not only were the sort of the playmates of the aristocrats, particularly like in French portraits, but they also represent fidelity. And she does show fidelity in her marriage to William of Orange. Now, in the background, as I mentioned, this exquisite cloud formation, we see nature, trees, poplar trees. A light shines through dimly, though. And so it is this need to represent the natural world along with portraiture. Now, the next painting is the one I wanted to include, a religious painting, and this is by Francisco de Zurbarán. Zurbarán was one of the greatest painters of the Spanish Baroque, and he paints St. Francis in meditation. And if you recall, St. Francis was the originator of the Franciscan order, St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis of Assisi was known for his vows of poverty. He was in a mendicant order, which means they vow poverty and they want to help. He also was the patron saint of birds and animals and children. He's painted many, many, many dozens of times throughout our history. Even our own Jan van Eyck painted St. Francis. And I want to talk a little bit about Zurbaran. Zurbaran painted for the church, and he actually painted over 34 likenesses of St. Francis. If you look at that somber color, this is very typical of the Spanish Baroque. If you look at our own Murillo in the Timken collection, Velázquez, Zurbaran, they use that very dark, rich background, a lot of black, kind of monochromatic. We see that beautiful chiaroscuro, that light that shines on the face of St. Francis. He's in meditation. What is he doing? He's contemplating life and mankind. He looks down at this exquisite skull that represents Adam and mankind, and he thinks about life and the future. So it is a very meditative painting, of course. You look at the title. I want to tell you a little bit more about Zurbaran. Zurbaran, as I mentioned, was focused primarily on religious paintings. However, in his lifetime, he did just a small handful, maybe 3, of the most exquisite still life paintings ever done in art history. In fact, his still life with lemons in the Norton Simon in Pasadena is considered by many art historians as the most exquisite still life painting ever done. I would say it is probably my favorite painting. And unfortunately, his son, who inherited his great gift for painting and moved away from religious subjects and did focus on still lifes, died very young. So these two important painters never got to fulfill one aspect of their creativity. Now, I wanted to show you a portrait done by a woman. Let me just go back 1 second. I did forget to mention something. If you can give me a moment to just go back. One thing about Spain during the Baroque is we have, and I mentioned earlier, the Counter-Reformation. So what is happening in Spain is these Protestant sects are developing, and the Catholic Church is getting a little bit worried, and they want to create imagery that harkens back to the importance of the Catholic Church and Catholic beliefs. And so they often, pardon me, they often depict, I'm terribly sorry, this has never happened to me during a lecture, I just have to turn my phone off. I'm just terribly sorry. The Protestant Reformation was a goal by the Spanish Church to actually help people reconnect to their Catholic roots. So you often have a lot of these religious subjects that harken back to the strength of the Catholic Church. Now, Judith Leister was a Dutch woman. She lived in Haarlem for a time, and Haarlem was where our own Frans Hals, we actually have a beautiful Frans Hals in the Timken, who was one of the greatest portrait painters of the Dutch Baroque. And she studied with him, and she was a magnificent painter and received a lot of acclaim. Don't think there weren't great women painters at this time. Now, this is one of the most beloved paintings in the National Gallery in Washington, and we capture this beautiful image of herself. And Judith Leister was very talented. So what is she doing? She's painting, she looks at us, she kind of confronts us, and she holds a brush, and actually she holds something like 18 brushes in her hands, and she's in a very elaborate costume. Well, most likely she didn't paint in this beautiful costume. This would be worn for much more important, not that painting wasn't important, but this is a more elaborate costume. So it was just her finely dressed, but she wanted to capture what she did. Now she paints a man playing a violin. And what is she indicating in this painting? She indicates that while music, as it's being played, is ephemeral, painting lasts for eternity. And so she's making a comment on the importance of art, and not to say that music doesn't last, because of course we have composers who record their music, but in a sense, it is more ephemeral, and paintings are kind of our window to history and our connection to history. So she was a very well-respected artist in her time, and she shows elaborate detail in her painting. We see the folds of the dress, the squirts of paint on her palette. She smiles with confidence. She's a lovely young woman. She wears a typical dress of the Dutch Baroque. And remember, Holland was was Protestant, although we did have Vermeer, for example, living in the Catholic corners of Holland and Delft. But it's more middle class. And even though she wears a little bit more of a elaborate dress, these people are capturing not the aristocracy, but more merchants and artists and people like that. So Judith Leister. Next, we're moving into the Rococo. We have these magnificent paintings by La Gillière, who was in the Rococo era, probably one of the greatest portrait painters. And I want to just mention something about the date. Because it is in the era of the Rococo, you would just assume that it was a Rococo style, but it really is more Baroque. So it harkens more to to the 17th century than the 18th century. Why? Well, the dark, rich colors. In the Rococo, we often see these sort of candy box colors, more pastels. We see a lot of mythology and their aristocracy. Here we have more of a Baroque style. And who are we capturing? Monsieur Pupol was a judge. And he was a well-born man who married into an upper class family. And I'm going to show you his beautiful wife, because we have something that's kind of rare in art history, in museums, is we have companion portraits. Because often when you have a portrait, we only have one or the other. And so we're very blessed to have the man and wife. Now, as I mentioned, he's a judge. He received a judgeship in Lyon, France, and so he wanted to commemorate it. So who does he go to? La Gillière. And he wants his likeness captured. He wears the beautiful flowing robes of his position, satin and linen gloves, and the ermine, the fur-trimmed red crimson cloak, the very detailed carved furniture. We have this exquisite library behind him. Again, this very confident look. He looks at his three-quarter turn. And as you can see, it is the 18th century where we begin to see more full-length portraits. And although this is not full length, we're edging on full length. Because of time constraints, I am going to go to our next painting, and that is of his wife, Marguerite de Sèvres. And she was, as I mentioned, from a more aristocratic family. Now, they weren't the aristocrats of France who didn't work. She did not work, of course, but he did. So it puts him at a status of very, very upper bourgeois. She's dressed in a magnificent gown. It's meant to be worn for entertainment. She is going to be entertaining because she holds a songbook of drinking songs that she will sing with her female friends and companions. It is resting on a harpsichord, a musical instrument, which is painted and also a little bit of carving at the bottom. Her chair behind her with damask fabric and also damask wallpaper is quite beautiful blue, that blue and red contrast. You see that flowing gown. She holds a silver fan. She has elaborate pearls and flowers in her hair. And I just want to comment that I'd attended a really wonderful lecture at the Timken before COVID closing. And I want to encourage you, when the museum reopens, to attend some of our lectures. They're just remarkable. And one I attended was by a Renaissance Baroque jewelry scholar. And she actually passed around the jewels of that time period. And you can see some of these drop Baroque pearls would be very similar to what she passed. But she talked about flowers. And many of these aristocratic or nearly aristocratic women, they love to put flowers in their hair because they kind of got bored with jewelry. So they often use flowers as embellishment. Also, you see what looks like a Roman bust, and that is because these women love to wear elaborate costumes. So this is meant to be like the bust of Hera or Juno. And so it's probably treated leather and embellished. As I say, she holds a silver fan. She has ermine, beautiful fur that decorates this exquisite gown. She looks at us with total confidence. She's an aristocrat. She's highborn. She's well married or nearly aristocrat. Now look at that really, really pale skin. Unfortunately, it was a style to try to sort of the Baroque or a Rococo Botox was to have a compound of arsenic used as a night cream. And I'm mentioning this because you see that ultra white skin. Well, they often like to try to sort of make themselves look more youthful. And this white compound, actually whitening compound, not only made people look younger, but it actually killed them. So it was very unfortunate they used this poisonous concoction to try to improve their beauty, I guess. All right, we just have one or two more, and we might only have time for one more, and I think we'll stop at this John Singleton Copley. This is a magnificent Georgian portrait, almost neoclassical. And so Mrs. Thomas Gage was married to the British general who controlled all the troops from England during the pre-Revolutionary War status. She was from a very important family. She wears a turban. It shows the costuming used by these upper class women, but it also relates to her father's Greek heritage. I'm sorry, Turkish heritage. Her mother was Greek. So he captures this woman in a beautiful dressing gown. Copley, who worked and lived in England and America, was known for being one of the most important painters of portraits during this time. And he captures this woman 2 years before the American Revolution. And Copley goes back to England, as does the Gage family. And for 200 years, this magnificent portrait was in the hands of the Gage family. She's beautiful. She looks introspective and intelligent. I see Allison is indicating that we might have some questions. So I will stop right there and let Allison take over.
Thank you so much, Karen. Yeah, thank you for such a great look. I love how many different time periods we go through here. You know, you can really see kind of the development of portraiture. I'm looking, and I don't see any questions in the chat at the moment, but if anyone wants to put their question in the chat, you can also unmute yourself. And I do see a raised hand. So Chris, we can go to you.
Hello, I just have a quick question about the portrait by Nicolas de Largière of his wife, Marguerite de Sèvres.
Yes.
Do we know if the damask was painted with Prussian blue?
Yes, most likely. That is such a good question, because obviously, I'm going to go back to that image. Obviously, they were using a lot of organic colors, and not necessarily this one, but a lot of them use lapis, scraped lapis, to get that really rich and deep blue. So I'm not sure, like that vermilion, that red, some of it actually came from butterfly wings. So these are a lot of naturalistic pigments, natural pigments. So I don't know if I answered that question, but so did I answer your question? I'm sorry.
Yes, I think so. Yes, it's a good guess that it probably is my understanding.
Yes, I think so too. I would agree with you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Like I said, you can unmute yourself. You can also put it in the chat. And if you're on Facebook, you can put it there as well. We're checking the comments on Facebook. But something that struck me is I just think it's so interesting how when you look at a portrait, you know, we think that you're learning about the person, like for this, you know, you're noticing the woman and it's kind of focused on her. But I feel like there's so much of the artist that we learn about in portraits also, that it's almost like a portrait of the sitter, but also of the artist. Like we almost learn equal amounts about them.
Oh, Allison, if you don't mind, I missed it to show you, this is your supposition is so important, because in this portrait of Rembrandt of St. Bartholomew, who's flayed alive for his beliefs, this is actually almost a self-portrait, because at this time, Rembrandt was facing terrible financial difficulties. And by a few years after this painting was done, he actually had to move from his home. He was bankrupt. So this introspective portrait of St. Bartholomew really relates to how Rembrandt was going through these terrible times in his life. So you're absolutely correct in that assertion, that this does say a lot about, sometimes overtly, like in this painting, and other times in a much more subtle manner. But that's very true.
Yeah, and other times in their self-portraits, right? They choose to to paint themselves, just obviously not trying to hide that. Yeah.
Oh, exactly, like the Van Dyck portrait.
Mhm. Yeah. Any other questions? We maybe have time for one more if anyone else wants to unmute themselves. If not,
I apologize for my phone ring. It's never happened in all the times I've lectured, so I really apologize.
oh, no problem. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, then we might wrap up. Thank you all again so much for joining us. And thank you, Karen, for a great tour. We always enjoy your tours. Just as a reminder to everyone, we do these every week. So every Thursday at 11 a.m., you can go to our Facebook page or, oh, thank you. Yes, you can go to that link right there. So timkenmuseum.org/calendar has all of our event listings. So different lectures or tours that are coming up. So we have one, like I said, next week, Thursday at 11 a.m. And if you go to that link, then you can see all the ones that are coming up in April. So thank you so much, Karen. And thank you everyone for joining.
As always.
Yeah,
Bye-bye, everyone.
all this time.
Thank you so